Hello, today we're going to look at how we turn our ideas about this play, Inspector Calls, into honest to goodness paragraphs in response to an essay question. Because a lot of students, they watch these YouTube videos, they know a lot about the play, but they don't necessarily know how to turn those ideas into the kind of A-star quality paragraphs that are going to rock an examiner's world. Here's a very brief overview of the specification, the expectations for the AQA exam board question on Inspector Calls. You've only 45 minutes, you have a choice of 2 questions, please only write on one, you're just wasting time for your second one. And also, it's a personal thing, but for me, I do 15 minutes planning, 25 minutes of the writing, and then I check the spag at the end, the spelling, punctuation, grammar, and make sure I haven't made any glaring errors. Now here you can see some of the examiner's guidance in the mark scheme. This is what the examiner is looking at. He's got this by his side next to his cigarette and his cup of coffee as he's marking your exam script. Unfortunately, I don't think it necessarily says clearly to a student at any rate what it is they're being assessed on. So on the next slide you're going to see how this examiner speak is broken down into plain English. And here we are, as promised, my translation, if you like, of highfalutin examiner speak. 6.1, I've gone for the top bands because we're all aiming for A stars. Irrespective of ability, we're all trying to reach for the stars here. So let's break down that top band criteria, mark criteria. 6.1, it talks about an insightful exploratory response to task. In basic English, this just means answer the question you've been set and do a good job of it. Don't start waffling on about things that are relevant to the question you've been set. 6.2, the examiner says, insightful exploratory response to text. What this basically means is that you need to say some intelligent things about this play. You need to show some insight, some knowledge, some understanding of an Inspector Calls. 6.3, the examiner says, close analysis of detail to support interpretation. What I say is, wow, write a lot about a little. Don't just skim over a lot of stuff, doing very kind of shallow, superficial analysis. Take one little idea and really kind of analyse it in depth. Delve into it, lock onto it, and develop your interpretation of that quote or reference to the text. 6.4, evaluation of the writer's use of language and or structure and or form and effects on readers' audience. In plain English, look at the effects of language and structural techniques, and if you can, because it uses that word evaluate, if you can, come up with more than one interpretation for the piece of evidence that you're looking at. This isn't always possible, but if you can do it, it gets an examiner very excited. It boosts your chances of that A star immeasurably. And finally, 6.5, convincing imaginative interpretations of ideas and themes. What this means is you need to look at the ideas or the themes the writer's trying to put across, the writer's trying to get out there, and make sure you do a good job of it. Now here's a question that popped up about a year or two ago. You get 2 questions in the AQA exam paper. The first one tends to be thematic. It expects you to explore a theme of the text. The second question on Inspector Calls tends to be more character orientated, more character focused. So some years it will be Mrs. Burling, some years it will be Inspector Gould. In 2014 it was Eva Smith, and this is the question that was set. What do you think is the importance of Eva Smith in Inspector Calls, and how does Priestley present her? Now on the next slide, what we're going to do, and I urge you to do this in the exam, is to think about what are the key words here, what is it exactly I'm being asked to do. And just to reiterate, you're only answering one of those questions on Inspector Calls. You can bet the farm every year some noddy waste their time writing both, and of course that greatly affects the quality of their responses and their ultimate final grade. So this is what I've identified as being the key words of the question. In other words, this is what I think the question is asking me to do. It's asking me to think about what is the importance of Eva Smith, how is she important in the play, and also how does Priestley present her. So in a sense, it's almost asking me two questions, this exam question, although there may be opportunities for me to combine ideas on both these things, her importance and how Priestley is presenting her. The plan. I'll tell you now, a little bit of an examiner dies when he opens an exam script and he realises there is no plan. This immediately tells him that whoever's writing this exam script is basically bluffing it, is basically busking it, is writing it as they go along, and you can well imagine that even Oxford professors would have a problem writing fluently and articulately and to an extremely high level without having at least thought and planned and plotted what it is they're going to say. So I'll say this once, but it does bear reiterating. Make a plan, spend a good 10 to 15 minutes thinking and making some rough notes on what you're going to write about in this exam before you actually start writing your essay response. I guarantee if you fail to plan, you are succeeding in failure. You will fail to achieve the high grade that you are capable of. Proper planning prevents poor performance. Fact. Here's a close-up of one of my first points, which is going to be about how Eva Smith's surname is important and what it represents, and also the dramatic genre from which the idea of the name reflecting the character's nature is drawn. So you can have a good look at that to see the rough ideas I've come up with. My second point about Eva is going to be about the way the inspector stresses the gruesome nature of her death and why he thinks this is important, to use that word from the exam question. We're going to say that its impact, the effect of this gruesome detail is to force the Burlings to change their ways, and I'm also going to look in particular about the way it affects Sheila Burling. In this section I'm going to be looking at the way Eva's death brings about great pain for the Burling family themselves. This, I believe, is one of Priestley's main messages. So Eva dies, and of course she takes her unborn child with her, which also happens to be the Burlings' grandchild. So this explores the idea that in society, pain in one section of society impacts and affects another. And so it's important that we all treat each other fairly to minimise that pain. You'll notice at the bottom as well, I've got 3 arrows coming off one quotation. This, I'm hoping, is my chance to do some real showboating in front of the examiner, pulling out 3 interpretations for one piece of evidence and really rocking his world and making him think about A-stars for old Johnny. If I've got time, and I may not, given that I've only got 45 minutes to do the job, if I've got time, then I've got some other ideas I can play around with here. This is my B list, my plan B if you like. Time allowing, I might talk about Eva being a moral person, how that's important because it challenges the offensive assumptions of Mrs. Burling, who's quick to denigrate and criticise working class girls. Girls of that class, she says. I might also talk about the rape by Eric and how this is symbolic of the way the rich exploit and abuse the poor. So I've got some other ideas on the back burner, if you like, if time allows. Just before I show you the paragraph I've produced, I'll just pop in front of you one last time the plan for my first paragraph or paragraphs. It's about the importance of her surname and how I've developed that as a plan. You see my skeletal structure there, my rough notes. Some people prefer doing bullet points, that's fine. Me, I'm more of a mind map man. You can see my rough notes here. On the next slide, you're going to see how I turn those ideas into polished paragraphs. And here we are, those A-star standard model paragraphs that I've crafted with my own fair hand. God, I'm good in response to that essay question. Just drink in that bad boy right there. Priestley presents Eva as a symbol for the proletariat. That's a posh word for the working class. A social class he sees as exploited by the social elite, as represented by the Burlings. Her name is significant because Smith is a common British surname. Therefore, she represents the common man or everyman. Interestingly, the word Smith alludes to a worker, such as a blacksmith or goldsmith. This emphasises her link to the working class. I won't bother reading the second part of this. The reason I read that first part is I just want you to now look at some of the high-level lexis, the high-level language or vocabulary I've used to present my ideas in, to frame my ideas with. So I've used words like symbol and proletariat, exploited, represented. I've also, you'll notice, used adverbs like interestingly to launch into my deeper analysis of the words. I always like using a connective like moreover, furthermore, or an adverb like interestingly to launch into that deeper analysis of a bit of language. And on the next few slides, I'm going to be linking this paragraph to the mark criteria so you can see quite clearly what I've done to satisfy the demands of the examiner. The first thing we said the examiner is going to be focusing on is how well you've answered the question. It's all very well writing insightful things about this play in the exam, but if they don't link to the question, that's going to affect your grade. I've used key words from the question, such as presents. Priestley presents Eva as a symbol, so the examiner knows I'm responding directly to the question set. You'll notice at the bottom as well, Eva then is essential to promoting this socialist idea. I've used the word essential because essential is a synonym, or another word meaning the same thing. It's a synonym for important, and importance, I believe, was one of the key words in the question. So I've made sure through the structure and the language of my paragraphs that I'm linking back to the question. That's going to get me some brownie points from the examiner. I'm not even going to attempt false modesty here. These are outstanding paragraphs, and in both of them I'm clearly saying intelligent things about the play. I'm considering the significance of the surname, and I'm also thinking about how that is a convention or a trope or a feature of the morality play dramatic genre, and why Priestley has bothered to use that convention. So read through these paragraphs at your leisure and appreciate I'm saying some mighty clever things about this play. Then again, if I wasn't, I'd have no business being an English teacher, would I? Well, we talked about writing a lot about a little, and you can see in that first paragraph we've taken that little piddly word Smith and we've pulled out a whole party bag of ideas there. We've talked about it referring to the working class, we've talked about it referring to Eva representing that social tier of society. We've also talked about the word Smith alluding to a worker and entrenching that link between Eva Smith and the proletariat. So one little word and some really in-depth analysis of that word. That's going to rock the examiner's world. Although I said before it's not always possible to pull out multiple interpretations, two interpretations for one piece of evidence, in this case I have been able to do that. I've said that Smith shows that she represents the proletariat. I've also suggested that Smith, because it links to a blacksmith or a goldsmith, is entrenching and deepening that link and that bond between Eva Smith and the proletariat. In the second paragraph, I've explored an aspect of form or structure. I've looked at the dramatic genre of the morality play and talked about why Priestley has used a convention of it. It's so important when you're writing these essay responses that you do analyse the language of the play. You do look at the effects of language, what is the writer trying to say or do or show. It can break an examiner's heart if he sees a very smart student with a good understanding of the play but not actually locking in on language and analysing the effects, considering interpretations. Make sure you do this, or sadly your grade will suffer. The fifth thing that the examiner is judging you on is how well you address and explore the ideas or themes of the play. These themes that the writer is trying to telegraph or convey to the audience or the reader. You can see where I've highlighted, Priestley presents Eva as a symbol for the proletariat, a social class he sees as exploited by the social elite as represented by the Burlings. So I'm linking my exploration of Eva Smith, which is of course the focus of the essay. I'm linking Eva to some of the themes that J.B. Priestley is trying to convey to his audience, namely that capitalism involves exploitation of one tier of society by another. I've done something similar in the second paragraph, where I've talked about Priestley using these conventions of the morality play in order to present or promote his own moral, to put across his own theme or idea. Namely, that as a society we need to reject capitalism and embrace socialism to ensure a fairer deal for everyone. Here's my plan again for the paragraph or paragraphs exploring the importance of Eva's gruesome suicide. I'm showing you this simply because in the next slide is the finished product, those polished, shiny, spiffy A-star paragraphs that are going to wow an examiner. And here we are, just drinking that A-star goodness. Priestley depicts Eva's death in graphic detail. The inspector states that Eva's corpse was a nasty mess and that swallowing a lot of strong disinfectant burnt her inside out, of course. This use of gruesome description is important because it emphasises the inspector's function. He wishes to shock the Burlings out of their selfish capitalist ways and force them to see that their heartless behaviour has horrific consequences. I won't bother reading that second paragraph. Just a few things to focus on in the paragraph, the first paragraph I wrote. You notice my evidence, my quotations aren't huge. They're 6 or 7 words, 10 max. In the old days, you used to talk about appropriate quotations. You don't want to whack in some big, meaty quotation. It just looks like you're filling time and trying to fill space in the exam. Keep your quotations short and relevant or appropriate, and of course do a good job of analysing them on the back end in the explanation section. Top tip, words like emphasises and highlights and conveys a sense of. These are lovely ways to launch into your explanation. I know you can say this shows or this suggests, but I always think emphasise and highlights, that sounds very high level. And of course, what a writer is trying to do is to bring your attention to certain things. So he is trying to highlight or illustrate or emphasise things. Final thing to notice, my sentences aren't that long. Yes, they're complex sentences in some cases. There may be commas and connectives, but I'm not doing these big, hairy, Godzilla-size sentences that take up 4 or 5 lines. That always looks sloppy. Far better to kind of organise your thoughts, marshal your thoughts using shorter sentences. Otherwise, it just looks like you're flying by the seat of your pants and just trying to stuff everything in as short a time as possible. The next 2 slides are just other model paragraphs that I produced on the back end of that plan from the beginning of this video. You might want to pause the video and just have a look at that and appreciate what I've done to make that a high level paragraph. If that's not an A-star, I'll be very, very surprised. I apologise for the rather scratchy serial killer handwriting. That's just my handwriting style. And I always think it's useful for students to see what writing looks like on a piece of A4 like they'll have in an exam. Because of course I could show you something on Microsoft Word, but you don't really get an idea of what size that will be on an exam script. Yes, paper and pen is very 20th century. That's still the way they do it in the exam room though. So when you are practicing writing exam responses in preparation for the exam, do try and do it with pen and paper rather than clacking away on your keyboard, because you want to condition yourself, train yourself for the realities of the exam hall. And here's another of the model paragraphs. This is the one where I hope to dazzle the examiner with my multiple interpretations of one line. I've taken that fire, blood and anguish line the inspector uses at the end of the play when he's waggling his finger severely at the Burlings, and I've pulled out 3 interpretations for that. So in terms of analysing language, I'm certainly hitting the high notes. Final thing about these paragraphs, you'll notice at the end of them, I'll often say things like, either then is X, Y, Z, or either then is important because X, Y, Z. So I'm always making sure that I'm linking what I'm doing and what I'm saying to the exam question. The examiner appreciates that and he will mark accordingly. And here's my conclusion. You get some people trying to write a small novel for an inclusion. I've never been a big fan of that. Keep it short and sweet. In conclusion, comma, that's a nice way at GCSE for launching into your conclusion. And all I've done is taken one or two of my main points and presented them, linking them, of course, to the exam question. So in conclusion, Precy presents Eva as a symbol for the exploited proletariat. Remember, present was a key word from the question. He uses horrific imagery to shock the Burlings into rejecting capitalist values and embracing socialism. That was one of the points I made in my essay. Eva is vital. That's a synonym or another word for important. Eva is vital to show the Burlings that in hurting others, they ultimately damage themselves. So I think with that conclusion, very briefly, again, it's not an epic. I'm not burning through a rainforest to write that conclusion, but I am, in a sense, in a short, sweet way, answering the question set. And that, in a nutshell, is how you take an essay question, break it down into key words, crank out a plan, and turn that plan into silky, shiny A-star paragraphs. All that remains is for me to wish you the best of luck in your revision, and I hope that you knock it out of the park come exam day.